I never imagined that grief could be weaponized until the moment we lowered my grandfather into the earth. The rain over Seattle was a heavy, slate gray, blurring the sharp edges of the glass towers Eugene Moore had raised with his own sweat. I stood there, witnessing the dirt settle onto the mahogany casket, feeling a hollow ache that reached deeper than my marrow. But for the man standing next to me, my father, Grant, this wasn't a final goodbye. It was a hostile takeover. As the priest murmured about eternal peace, I felt Grant's posture shift. He leaned toward me, his shoulder nearly touching mine, and for a fleeting second, I anticipated a gesture of comfort. Instead, his voice pierced the solemnity, low and toxic. He didn't even bother to look at me. He just fixed his gaze on the grave and whispered, "There is no will, Maya. I've handled it. You won't see a single cent. Your brother is the only heir now." The shock didn't target my heart. It struck my gut. I glanced at Tyler, my younger brother, who was adjusting his silk tie with a grin that looked like a victory lap. The betrayal was surgical, swift, and perfectly timed. They weren't just seizing the assets. They were scrubbed my name from the legacy I had fortified with years of labor. I remained motionless. I refused to let a single tear escape. I just tightened my grip on the umbrella until my knuckles turned as pale as the cemetery marble, feeling the first spark of a very different kind of fire. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family? Let me know your story down in the comments. I didn't waste my breath on an explanation. I didn't beg for a place at a table that was being dismantled right in front of me. Grant and Tyler exited the cemetery in a sleek black town car, likely heading to some high-end establishment to toast to their unearned fortune. I stayed until the final clod of dirt was turned. Then, I drove directly to the Moore & Sons headquarters. By the time I reached the office, midnight was a shadow over the city. The building stood as a silent monolith of glass, glowing faintly under the streetlights. My keycard still functioned for the moment. I walked past the lobby portrait of my grandfather, his eyes filled with a standard of honor that Grant had failed to meet. I didn't go to my desk to pack. I went to the server room. The air inside was freezing, humming with the mechanical heartbeat of the firm. I sat down, the blue light of the monitors reflecting in my pupils. This wasn't a collapse. It was a reconciliation of accounts. I had been the uncredited partner in their version of family for 26 years. Now, I realized it had been a predatory loan, and I'd been the one paying the interest. My fingers traversed the keyboard with the precision of an architect. I accessed the project files for Sterling Heights, the crown jewel of our current portfolio. My pulse didn't quicken when I saw Tyler's name typed into the lead architect's slot. It was expected. He'd spent his life riding the elevator while I climbed the stairs. For 3 years, I had drafted every structural curve and calculated every load-bearing column of that project. I had worked until 4 in the morning while Tyler was out exhausting the firm's credit line on luxury service. I opened the permissions log and began revoking access. One by one, I stripped the digital keys from Grant and Tyler's accounts. Access denied. The red text flickered on the screen, a quiet correction for a loud betrayal. I leaned back, analyzing the lines of code. This was the gap in competence they had ignored. They believed they had inherited a fortress, but they'd actually just inherited a blueprint with no architect. I was the one who held the intellectual property. I was the one who knew where the structural weaknesses were hidden. I recalled 18 months ago, when the firm was on the brink of a liquidity crisis. Grant had approached me, smelling of vintage scotch and failure. I had transferred $120,000 from my personal savings to keep the payroll afloat. I had convinced myself I was protecting the name. Now, I realized I'd just been funding my own disappearance. I checked the timestamp. 12:03 a.m. In less than 15 minutes, I had effectively paralyzed the technical operations of a $120 million estate. I rubbed my eyes, searching for a trace of regret. But there was only a sharp, cold clarity. My loyalty had been a luxury they'd overdrawn for years, and tonight, the credit limit reached 0. The silence of the office felt different now. It didn't feel like isolation. It felt like a blank slate. I stood up and walked to my desk. picking up the small, cracked photo frame. It was a picture of me and Eugene on the day I passed my licensing exam. He'd told me that a sturdy building must be built on a foundation of fairness. Grant and Tyler believed they were the authors of my ruin. They had no idea I was the only one who knew how to keep the structure from buckling. As I exited, the lobby was dark. But my mind was illuminated by a different kind of dawn, the kind made of steel, numbers, and lethal, silent precision. The next morning, the office was a stage for a high-stakes performance. I was at my desk by 7 in the morning, watching the sun hit the skyline, waiting for the first fracture in their facade. It didn't take long. By 9, the sounds of frantic shouting began to resonate from the corner office. Grant convened an emergency family meeting in the main boardroom, but it was a public execution. He invited the senior partners and the firm's legal counsel, setting a scene intended to break me. As I entered, the room went silent. Grant sat at the head of the table, his face flushed with unearned power. Tyler was beside him, reclining in a leather chair that was too big for his character. "Maya," Grant began, his voice booming with a false gravity. "We've had some technical glitches this morning. It seems the Sterling Heights files are inaccessible." He leaned forward, his gaze narrowing. "But that's a minor distraction. We're here for a formal announcement. Tyler is officially taking over as lead architect and vice president. Effective immediately." I didn't move. I just watched him. One of the partners, a man who had seen me work 36-hour shifts to save projects, looked away. Grant noticed the tension and escalated. "Let's be realistic, Maya. You're erratic. You're focused on the past. Architecture is a legacy of strength, and you're just a girl with a hobby. Tyler has the vision this firm needs." Tyler let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "Don't take it personally, sis. Dad is just doing what's best for the bloodline. You're a distraction we can't afford right now." The room erupted into a light, polite laughter among the partners who were too afraid to lose their bonuses. The manipulation was so thick it was suffocating. They were trying to convince everyone, including me, that the last 8 years of my life didn't exist, that the designs on that server weren't mine, that I was a ghost in my own building. "A distraction?" I asked, my voice emerging cold and steady. "Is that what you call the person who designed the structural skeleton for the Northgate project? Or the person who personally negotiated the steel contracts that saved this firm 12% on overhead?" Grant slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! You've been living in a delusion, Maya. You're dismissed. From this board, from this firm, and from this family. Pack your things. Security will escort you out by noon." I surveyed the room. I saw the partners studying the floor. I saw Tyler checking his reflection in his phone. Panic didn't surface, only a clinical realization. This wasn't the loss of a father. It was the removal of an anchor that had been dragging me into the depths for a decade. "I won't need until noon," I said, rising. I didn't look back. I didn't need to witness their smug victory, because I knew the math didn't add up for them. They thought they were the kings of the mountain, but they had forgotten who surveyed the land. They weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were shocked that I'd stopped following the script. As I walked out, the air felt purified. This wasn't a breakdown. It was an audit, and Grant Sterling was about to discover exactly how much he owed me. The rain returned as I sat in a quiet booth at a cafe 3 blocks away. Across from me sat Vance Holloway. He didn't look like the corporate sharks my father employed. He looked like a man who studied the wreckage. He had the Sterling estate files spread out, his pen hovering over a line of numbers like a scalpel. "Grant is moving fast, Maya," Vance said, his voice a low baritone. "He's already filing for a summary judgment to take full control of the Moore Trust. He wants you legally severed before the month is out." I watched a single drop of condensation slide down my glass. He thinks he's playing chess. He doesn't realize I've already removed the pieces. I explained the server lock and the $120,000 I'd used to float the firm. Vance didn't smile, but his eyes sharpened. This was the professional escalation. We weren't discussing feelings anymore. We were discussing the systematic dismantling of a $120 million empire. Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from my mother, Alana. She'd been a shadow in that house for years. The message was short and cryptic. The floorboards in the library, third plank from the window. Look for the black ledger. It's time. I stared at the screen. My mother had been the guardian of truth for 26 years, carrying secrets that must have felt like lead. This was the burden of secrets, the silent weight that had dimmed her spirit. She was finally handing me the key to the vault. "Vance," I said, sliding the phone toward him. "We need to get into the Sterling estate. Tonight." Vance looked at the message and then back at me. "If what I suspect is in that ledger is actually there, Maya, this ceases to be a civil dispute. We're looking at a criminal takeover." That night, the Sterling mansion felt like a tomb. I used my old code to enter. The silence of the house pressing against my ears, I made my way to the library, the scent of Grant's expensive cigars clinging to the air. I found the third plank, pried it back, and there it was. A small, leather-bound ledger in Eugene's unmistakable, meticulous handwriting. I opened it under the glow of my flashlight. My breath hitched. It wasn't just a record of assets. It was a record of betrayals. Eugene had documented Grant's embezzlement dating back to the late 90s. But more than that, there was a notarized letter tucked into the back flap. "To my true heir, Maya," it began. My vision blurred. My grandfather had known. He had seen Grant's greed and Tyler's incompetence, and he had built a failsafe. He hadn't left the firm to Grant. He had left it to me, under a blood acknowledgement clause that bypasses traditional inheritance laws. I tucked the ledger into my coat, feeling its weight against my ribs. It felt like a heartbeat. My mother appeared in the doorway. She didn't say a word. She just nodded once, her eyes shining with a fierce clarity. She had waited a lifetime for this moment. As I walked back out into the Seattle night, the rain felt like a baptism. I wasn't just the invisible girl anymore. I was the architect of Grant Sterling's downfall. Vance sat in his office 48 hours later, the black ledger open under a desk lamp. "Maya," he said, tapping a finger on a series of bank transfers. "This is the kill shot. We didn't just find a hidden will. We found a paper trail of a felony." The criminal twist was more devastating than I had imagined. Vance had spent the last 2 days cross-referencing Eugene's ledger with public records. He turned the laptop screen toward me. "Look at the dates. These 2 transfers, $60,000 and $36,000, were moved from the Moore Trust to a private account held by Norman Pierce, your grandfather's attorney. They were labeled as consulting fees, but the timing is identical to the day the original will disappeared from Pierce's safe." My blood ran cold. It wasn't just greed. It was a conspiracy. Grant hadn't just gotten lucky that there was no will. He had paid to have it erased. He had bought a lawyer's integrity for $96,000 to ensure I stayed penniless. "And it gets worse," Vance continued. "We ran a forensic analysis on the revocation document Grant presented. The signature? It's a high-resolution composite, a forgery. Grant didn't just hide the truth. He manufactured a lie." I stared at the forged signature. This was the moment any remaining path to redemption for my father vanished. This wasn't a family squabble. This was a crime. Grant had turned our family name into a criminal enterprise, and Tyler was the willing accomplice. "This is no longer about a seat at the table, Vance," I said, my voice steady. "This is about a cell." "Exactly," Vance replied, snapping the ledger shut. "I've already contacted the district attorney's office. They're interested in the fraud, but they're more interested in the embezzlement records your grandfather kept. Grant hasn't just been stealing from you. He's been defrauding the state for years." The realization hit me with the weight of a falling skyscraper. Grant had been so obsessed with erasing me that he hadn't realized he was leaving a trail of evidence behind him. He thought I was the weak link. He had no idea that by trying to bury me, he had actually provided the shovel. The Seattle courtroom was a cathedral of cold marble. Grant sat at the plaintiff's table, leaning back with a smug confidence. Tyler was beside him, scrolling through his phone. They didn't even look at me. To them, I was just a formality. The judge, Eleanor Vance, didn't waste time. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice echoing, you maintain that your father revoked his original will and left the estate to you and your son? That is correct, Your Honor. Grant said, standing with a practiced grace. My father realized that stability was paramount. He chose the natural order of succession. The natural order, the judge repeated, then looked at Vance. And the defense? Vance stood up. He used a predator's precision. Your Honor, we submit that the natural order, Mr. Sterling speaks of is a fabrication built on fraud and a $96,000 bribe paid to a disgraced attorney. The room erupted in whispering. Grant's face went from pale to a deep, bruised crimson. This is a desperate lie, he barked, but the judge slammed her gavel. Sit down, Mr. Sterling, she commanded. Vance called my mother to the stand. I watched Grant's eyes widen. He had spent 20 years assuming she was a silent ornament, but as Alana sat in that chair, she looked taller than I'd ever seen her. She produced the black ledger and testified to the years of Grant's abuse. Then, Vance delivered the finisher. He placed the certified birth record and Eugene's blood acknowledgement deed on the bench. Your Honor, Vance said, turning to look at Grant. The reason Grant Sterling hated Maya wasn't because she was unfit. It was because he knew the truth. Eugene Moore recognized Maya as his primary blood heir and protector of the legacy. I stood up then. I walked to the center of the room and looked Grant in the eye. He looked smaller now, his suit looking like a costume. You never called me your daughter, I said, my voice cutting through the tension. And now I know why. You didn't see a child. You saw a threat to the money you were stealing. Tyler stood up, his voice cracking. This is insane. I'm the heir. Your dad lied, Tyler, I said. You've been living in a fantasy built on a forged signature. And today, the bill is due. The judge struck the gavel again. Based on the evidence, specifically the forensic report and the testimony of Alana Sterling, this court finds sufficient cause to freeze all assets of the Moore Trust. Furthermore, I am referring Grant Sterling and Norman Pierce for criminal prosecution. Grant collapsed into his chair. He looked at me, his eyes filled with a desperate rage. You've destroyed this family. I looked at him, feeling absolutely nothing. No, Grant. I just finished the audit. The following weeks felt like the demolition of a toxic foundation. With Grant and Norman Pierce behind bars, the pillars of lies they had built finally crumbled. I returned to the Sterling District headquarters on a Tuesday. I walked straight to the CEO's office, the office that had belonged to Eugene, then briefly to a pretender. I was sitting behind the mahogany desk when a knock came at the door. Tyler stood there. He wasn't wearing his designer suit. He looked disheveled. Maya, he said, his voice a whisper. The bank froze my accounts. I have nowhere to go. I looked at him. I didn't feel resentment or joy. This was the final account. You were a willing accomplice, Tyler, I said. You watched him try to erase me and you laughed. I know, he choked out. I was wrong. Please, I just need a chance. I studied him. I thought of Eugene's words about fairness. The firm is in debt because of the bonuses you and Grant took. If you want a place here, you start in the mailroom. Minimum wage. No shortcuts. You earn your way back, or you leave. Tyler swallowed hard, but he nodded. Thank you. I'll take it. When he left, the office fell into a deep peace. I stood at the window, looking out over the city. My mother had moved into a small house by the coast, finally free. She had sent me a note. The ledger is closed, Maya. This wasn't just a victory of money, it was a victory of truth. I had been the silent architect for so long, and now the building finally matched the blueprints. I had saved Moore and Sons not with fear, but with the hard facts of integrity. I walked over to my grandfather's portrait. The invisible architect was gone. Standing there was the rightful guardian. I whispered, "The foundation is solid, Grandpa." I walked out into the Seattle night, the city lights shimmering. For the first time in 26 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like Maya Sterling, and as I drove toward the horizon, I knew I wouldn't be looking back. If you believe that character is worth more than a title, share this story. Let's show the world that the truth always finds its way home.